Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. Thanks for joining in with us today. And well, my name is Asutosh, and I'll be presenting this entire session today for the next 1 hour or so. And I have Reena with me, who is here to help you guys with any questions that you have. You can put it on the chat, and she'll be able to answer them. I'll also have a look at the chat window from time to time, but yeah, she'll be out there to help you out anytime when you have a question over there. So without further delay, let me just go ahead and start with the webinar. All right. So first thing first, let's look at few of the references, I guess. Not the goals. I think we have got the incorrect title over there, but yeah. Anyways, so for references, which is few of the stuff which you would really like to have a look at in case you're new to Corda, and then just start from there probably. So we have our YouTube channel where we regularly post different videos about Corda and on technical and non-technical aspects, both of them. We have a free training site, so if you're interested to learn more and get yourself trained, that's the place to go. We have a community of developers, and our basically our Corda community, which is available at the public Slack at slack.corda.net. And then the official documentation, docs.corda.net. The Corda open source is available in GitHub, and you can have a look at it, which is available at github.com/Corda. And if you want to really reach out to us in the sense of the developer relations team, which me and Irina both belongs to, then the email would be r3devrelations@r3.com. And if you like to tweet, then our official handles are at the rate Corda blockchain and at the rate inside R3. And you may like to use the hashtags #Corda or #R3. All right, so with that behind us, we are all set to move on. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to basically have a look at blockchain, Corda and blockchain from a trade finance point of view. So this is a trade finance Corda webinar. And just since this is talking about Corda, I'll give a brief introduction of Corda, won't be a lot, but we'll talk about what different components an application in Corda would have. And then I'll give you an introduction to letter of credit and our use case for today. And finally, we'll end with a demo and a little bit of a glimpse of the code that will be used in the demo. Right. So first of all, let's talk about trade finance and what we as R3 are actually focusing on. So I'll not spend a lot of time, just a bit of it, and then we'll move on to our use case. So a few things that we're looking at in the trade finance space is basically payments and settlement, which is not really exactly trade finance, but it covers a lot of different domains as well. But that's pretty much important with a lot of issues around reconciliations and stuff, for which I think Corda or blockchain is a great fit. And we are also looking at KYC and KYS, or know your customer and know your suppliers. So this is really important from a trade finance point of view. And then negotiable title agreement, which is again the type of which is again the use case that we'll be talking about today, the letter of credit, right? So this is where you have your title of your assets being transferred between different parties and all. So a few of the examples that are worth mentioning is there are a lot of different parties or a lot of different companies are running different POCs on Corda. So a few of the notable ones are TradeSwift, GT Nexus, Bank Trade, and a lot of others. And then we also have some companies building products on Corda, which are some companies like Intellect and Infosys. So they are already trying to integrate Corda onto their blockchain, and a lot of them have been successful till now. All right, a few more examples. So there are some trade finance networks as well, which have been successful, like Contour, which is basically a live network of trade finance, exactly the same use case that we're talking about today. It is a letter of credit use case, and they already have big names with them. There are others like TradeSwift and TradeCloud, which you might want to look at. And then we have invoice management solutions, and then we have core banking providers, like I mentioned, Infosys, which has already included Corda into their software stack, or the Infosys Finacle, where they already have Corda in there, and companies like Oracle and Silver Lake as well. Right, so these are just few of the names and few use cases which we're focusing on as R3 as a whole and what we are doing. If you want more details around there, please reach out to us. But let's just concentrate on what we are really going to do today and what we're really going to showcase in our demo today. Right. So what we'll be doing is a letter of credit. So people who do not know what letter of credit is, will explain that in a bit. But yeah, so for that, now what we will do is here are some basic requirements. I think it's intuitive that you need to have a purchase order, which you should be able to create and then show it to your seller. So basically, before I just try to run through each of these different requirements, what I would do is try and explain what letter of credit is, right? So every time a buyer and a seller, they basically go ahead and come into a trade. So what they do is they do not exchange the goods and the payments on their own, but what they do is they take a letter of credit from their banks and the bank from each of their individual banks, and then finally once the bank provides them a letter of credit, the seller's bank would basically ask the seller to ship the goods, and then once the goods have been shipped, the seller can then go ahead and get the payment from his bank, while the buyer's bank would pay the seller's bank, and then finally the buyer would pay the buyer's bank, which will basically complete the entire process. So this is what happens on a broader scale, but I think this is from a high level. There are a lot of different angles to it, but then yeah, this is what happens at a higher level, rather than direct communication between the two parties, who are the buyers and the seller. There are the banks involved who also have this that's where the entire letter of credit thing comes into the play, and we'll look at that particular thing from a demo perspective and as well as from the code perspective. So looking at what are the different steps that we have. So our application should have the bare minimum functionality of creating a purchase order. So the purchase order is the one where you agree to purchase some sort of stuff from the seller, and then the seller ability for these buyers and sellers to communicate with the bank with regards to the letter of credit, and then create a bill of lading, which is generally what you create when you basically ship your goods, and then the ability to do the payments as well. So finally it all comes down to payments, right? And obviously finally to the ability to basically view your ledger and see what's happening with the assets that's on the ledger. Right. So that's basically what we'll be doing. And in terms of what are the different nodes and the stack that we'll be using for the letter of credit app is we'll have the buyer and seller, obviously, and then there will be two banks for each of these individual parties who will be handling their payment requirements and will be taking care of the letter of credit stuff. And also there will be a notary, obviously, to notarize our transactions. So we also have a front end which will be using to which basically all your end users could use to update their information onto the system or onto the entire Corda network, so that they'll be able to have an intuitive UI to use this. And one important thing or one fun fact to note is we actually have a company called Bolero who is actually doing this entire letter of credit and providing this as a service. So that's something which you might want to check out on their website. All right. So before we start with our demo, a few bits, because we'll also be looking at the code. So I just want to cover a bit about what the code would look like, and so that people understand who are coming new to this session. So we'll talk about few things around an application in Corda. So Corda is the platform, and then any application that you run on Corda is called a CorDapp. And that generally have three different components: the state, the contract, and the flow. The states are something which represent your assets, and then the contracts are basically the validations or the business rules that govern your evolution of assets. So you want to make any changes to your assets, you have to write down the rules that you want to have, so that when you change that asset, those rules are validated and your changes are said to be fine. And finally, you have the flows, which are used to mimic your business workflows. So every time you want to make a change, there is basically a business workflow which is involved. So these are like different steps which are performed at in a particular sequence, right? So that's what your workflows are, or Corda flows are. So all these three things combined together would form an application which we call as CorDapp, and that CorDapp is deployed onto your Corda node, which helps you do all these transactions on a Corda network. All right. So states as such are probably you might already know that Corda is a point-to-point. It is a point-to-point network, so there is no global broadcast. So similar is the fact for states. So states are not shared uh, on a global basis. They are shared on a need-to-know basis. So only the persons who are supposed to know about a particular asset on the ledger is the one who knows about it. It's not basically broadcasted to everyone that's there on the ledger, that's there on the network. So that's states. And then you have contracts. So contracts are the ones which basically validates your transactions. So you have your inputs and outputs on your transaction. Inputs are the assets that are already on your ledger, and the ones that you want to update. So you take your input from your ledger and then you create your output with your desired updates. So basically your input is immutable, so you can't really change them. So the way you do that is you consume or you mark your input, which is already on your ledger, or the asset already on your ledger, as 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 being used, and you create a new one with your updates. And finally, when you validate all the rules that are required for that change and all the rules come out to be true, then you're able to update your state and then put that on the ledger. Similarly, if there is any issue with your updates, with your validation of the rules, and you basically are not able to validate some of the rules correctly, that means your transaction is invalid. There's something going wrong. So you can just mark that transaction as invalid. So that's how your contract validations work. And finally, of the flows. So flows are the ones which help to put all these things together. They help you to communicate with different counterparties and basically send and receive data between them. So there are a few steps which I would just like to point out. This is basically for a simple point-to-point or two-party trade. So which is where you propose an update, and then propose an update is where you create a transaction. You say that this is the thing I have on the ledger, and this is the updated thing that I want. And then you check that update against your contract, sign the transaction, and send it over to your counterparties. And they will also do the same thing, just check the transaction with their version of the contract to see if everything is valid. And once everything is valid, they'll sign the transaction, send it back to the initiator. The initiator now can then go to the notary for notarization. And once the notary signs, they can basically record this transaction onto each and every individual parties involved in the transaction. Right. So that's how flows work. So a few steps which are performed on a sequential manner. So a complex flow might have different steps, but this is like one of the most basic flow that you would encounter in Corda. Right, so let's come back to our letter of credit application. So what are we really doing with our letter of credit? So this is basically what I was talking about, a broader look or a more in detail look at what our letter of credit application would really do, right? So these are the different steps that we will be following. So we have a buyer and we have a seller, and each of these are having their own banks. So the buyer will initially create a purchase order, which is basically an agreement, sort of an order that these are the stuffs that I want to buy from a seller. And this purchase order can then be so since we're working on a DLT, right? So once the purchase order is created, it is available with both the buyer and the seller, right? And then once they have the purchase order, this order needs to be financed. So your buyer will apply for a letter of credit through his bank. And then once the letter of credit is created, now both the banks, the buyers and the seller's bank, would know that there is a letter of credit which is created for the buyer. And the buyer's bank is now taking the responsibility of any sort of, or it's more like the guarantee that if the buyer defaults, then the banks will be responsible, and the buyer bank will take care of all the charges involved, right? So the buyer bank, once the letter of credit is accepted, the seller can add the bill of lading and ship the goods. So once the seller ships the good, the seller's bank will basically pay the seller because the goods has been shipped and the bill of lading has been created. And then the once the seller has been paid, the buyer bank can validate the status of your shipment, and then basically say they can pay the seller's bank. So so basically your seller gets paid, your seller's bank get paid by the buyer's bank, and finally the buyer can basically pay their own bank to complete the entire process. So everyone gets paid, and the buyer receives the goods, and the seller basically sells the good. That's how your letter of credit really works, right? So this is what we'll be demoing today using Corda as a blockchain network in a blockchain network. All right, so let's look at the demo. I'll just share my screen. So before that, all right. I'll just start the application. It will take a second, and then once it is started, probably it will take a bit more than I thought. But anyways, once it started, I think we would be able to access using our browser. It's not started yet. It'll take another minute or so. It's taking a bit longer than expected because we need to bring up the nodes and stuff. So that will take a few minutes. Yeah, I guess it's up now. All right, let me retry. Yeah, there you go. So we have our application is up. So if you could see, what we have is we have 5 different parties. So we have a party based in London, and then we have their bank also based in London. And similarly, we have a party based in China who are our exporters basically. And similarly, we have the bank as well in China. And finally, we also have a notary pool which will be used to notarize our transactions, right? And we have all our steps written down here, just like we had mentioned already. So let's just go ahead and look at what we really want to do first. So basically, we'll open up our importers. From the importer, we will have to first create our purchase order. So just click on create purchase order. We have this field which will help us to autofill all the details, and then you need to find out who the seller is. So we have to input that details. So for this particular thing, the seller is Lockmo Exporters. And once we have filled in all the details, we can just go ahead and create the purchase order. All right, so that should take a minute, and your purchase order has been created, which you can basically see here. And also a transaction has been done, which was the creation of your purchase order, right? And it has been shared with Unlock Importers and your signers. So basically, these are the signers who have signed this particular transaction. Now this purchase order should basically also be available with your seller. Yeah, so there you go. This purchase order is also available with your seller, so they know that a purchase order has been created. That's the power of PLT. And once you have the purchase order done, your buyer can now go ahead and apply for the letter of credit with his bank, right? I'll go ahead with auto completing everything. And then your issuing bank is the Bank of London, and the advising bank will be Shenzhen. There you go. So once we have filled out all the details, so for the purpose of this demo, we have this autocomplete, which is basically filling out all the fields. But yeah, for a real application, you have to fill out these details on your own. So just to save time, we have something that is filling it up for us. And thus the letter of credit would now have been created, right? So if you look at the transactions, what we have is your purchase order is now locked, and this letter of credit has been, or an application has been done, right? So this application will basically need to be accepted or approved by the bank. So if you go to the bank and if you look at the letter of credit application in your bank, here you go. So you have an application for letter of credit, which you can now approve as a bank. So once that letter of credit has been approved, this detail will now be sent to the seller as well, or the seller's bank, not exactly the seller. So if you go to the seller's bank, I think you should have the details here. So there you go. So the letter of credit has been issued, and you can see that details here. There's no bill of lading created now yet, but yeah, that needs to be, once this is, because the seller of letter of credit has been issued, the seller is now ready to create the bill of lading. You can go to the seller and say create bill of lading, and autofill all your fields and say submit. All right, so what that would do is it would update our letter of credit, and the status is now laded, that you can see in the transaction as well, right? And finally, once you have laded it, you can say ship the goods. So basically now our goods have also been shipped, right? You can see the transaction as well, and as well as the status as shipped, right? So the goods have been shipped. So the next step is for the seller to for the seller's bank to basically pay the seller, because he has done his part. He has sold, he has sent out the shipment to the buyer. So the seller's bank can now just go ahead and pay the seller, right? So if you can also have a look at the bill of lading. You can see the owner is now the exporter. So they have actually sold, they've actually shipped the products, and then you can just say that take an action, which is to pay the seller. And what this would do is it will make all the payments for the seller, and as you can see, the status has been updated to beneficiary paid, right? So that means your beneficiary has been paid for the shipped goods. Now the next step is basically once the seller bank has paid it, the seller bank's bank is needed to be paid, and who would do the payment? It's the buyer's bank. We go to the buyer's bank here. This is the First Bank of London, which is your buyer bank, and they can see that the status is beneficiary paid, so they can now pay the seller's bank as well. All right, so advisory has also been paid, and now the next step is just to make sure that we have the buyer's bank is actually paid off by the buyer, right? So which is our last step, to pay the buyer. So the buyer can see that the advisory has been paid, which means the seller's bank has been paid. Now it's his turn to make the payment and settle this entire letter of credit process, or the entire cycle. You can just say settle, and that should do it for us. Okay, so yeah, so what we need is, we see a error saying insufficient balance because we haven't actually issued any balance for the buyer. So yeah, we should have done that earlier, but yeah, anyways, we can do this now as well. So if I go to issue, and then I can actually go ahead and make some payment to this guy. I think 2 million will be enough. So in order to settle, I think the buyer needs to have some credit in his account, which we didn't do earlier, but anyways, that should work. So if I look at the buyer now, he has a credit of 2 million now. So he should be able to settle his dues, and yeah, there you go. So the buyer is now able to settle, and this entire issuer has been paid, as you can see, and this entire process of letter of credit is now completed, right? So that's pretty much it. That's the demo that we wanted to do. It's pretty simple. I think what makes it really interesting is that the ability to see the status of your stuff, right, as it happens, right, which is where you which is where you basically get rid of a lot of reconciliation issues which happens in the process. So that's the benefit of using Corda, and also it's point to point, which is basically you only show stuff to people who are really interested to see what they want to see, and not just random stuff or which everyone which would basically you're not interested in and still you're able to see because of the public nature of some blockchains. So that's what it is. So now finally what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and try to show you a bit of some of the code which is basically responsible for running this application. So let me share my workspace with you. All right, yeah. So what you can see is this is our letter of credit application, and let me just close everything else. Yeah. So I'll not go into the details of each and everything because that's quite a lot, but I'll just showcase a particular flow for you guys so that and you can so that you can relate others. So we talked about three things, right? States, contracts, and flows. So that's what you could see here. You have the states, you have the contracts, and finally here you have the flows, right? So I think the most easiest one would be the purchase order. So if you look at the purchase order state, as I said, it's just your asset. So what your asset would have is all the properties that we have just filled in as part of our forms. So these are all we have. We have the owner, we have the seller, and then for all the details, we have created another file, which is basically or another class where you would actually go ahead and click on or basically fill in your details, and that becomes part of your state. So just few properties, a plain object basically, and then you have your participants. So these are the ones who would be basically viewing this particular state once it's issued on the ledger, right? And similarly, we would have a contract. So every time your purchase order is created, updated, or modified, anything that happens with the purchase order, there has to be certain rules that are needed to be validated. So this is our contract, and there are different actions that we would take on the contract. So on the purchase order, that is to issue, and then we have another action which is lock purchase order, which is when we log this when we create a letter of credit for this purchase order. So we lock this so that it prevents you from creating multiple letter of credits and do frauds with the same purchase order. So that's also one of the concern which we generally have, and the DLT could actually help you get rid of that, right? And finally, extinguish this, which is to get rid of your purchase order altogether. And depending on the action that we are taking, like issue or lock, we can validate different rules. Now it depends on what your business rules are. So we have certain common ones which might be interesting. So something like there is no input, so the transaction should be signed by the owner, and few other things which you could look at. Similarly, there are certain rules that we have for our lock purchase order action, and few for our or just a single one for our extinguish purchase order function, right? So these are the actions and all the different rules that need to validate based on those actions. So these actions are called as commands, you might already know. And then we finally have our flows, which is responsible for all the transfer of data and the execution of all your business flows within the Corda network. So if you look at, again, create purchase order flow, what we would be doing is pretty template thing, which we generally do in most of our flows is like for any transaction, right? You need a notary. So you need to get hold of the notary first, which we use for which we use the service hub. The service hub is basically one of the functions that we have, which will basically help you, or it's like a place where you could, within a flow, where you could get hold of most of your node services. And one of those services, the network map cache service, through which you can get your network map and eventually your notary. And finally, going ahead, we have we get our seller, and then we create a purchase order, which will be serve as an output for our transaction that we'll create. And then the command that we'll use is issue. This is the action that we're taking. We're issuing a purchase order. And finally, we build a transaction using the transaction builder, and we add the output and the command. And like we said, showed you during our explanation of the flow, is the different step that we want to perform. in a simple two-party trade is basically propose your output or propose your update, which is where we propose here by building a transaction. And then the next step is to verify your update, which is where you just go ahead and verify your transaction on the using your contract. So that's what is being done here. And finally sign the transaction and call the finality flow, which will just go ahead and finalize this flow onto your counterparties. The point to note here is we do not have a collect signatures flow. That's because we are not asking for the signature of the seller in this particular case, but there might be cases where in a two-party trade, you might need the signature of both the parties. In that case, you'll have the collect signatures flow, which will basically take care of collecting signature from your counterparty. Right. So similarly, there will be a little bit of a complex flows, which I don't want to go into at this point of time. So you can have a look at that on your own. So things like this will be easier, I believe. Yeah. So this is your apply for letter of credit. So if you get into this, what this would do is basically it will take your, if you look at the transaction here, this is your letter of credit state, and finally we are using the transaction builder, and what we are doing is we're incrementally basically going ahead and adding our states. We have an input state, which is our purchase order, which we already had on the ledger. So basically we're just querying the ledger. So to query the ledger, we have something called as the vault service, which will allow you to query your ledger and get a particular state of your interest that you can again put as an input. So that's what we have done in our builder. We have put our input state, and then our output state is basically but is the same purchase order, but this time the purchase order would actually be locked, right? So you can see that we have changed a few things, like we've just created a copy of it, and then we have updated a few states, and then finally we'll use this as an output purchase order. So if you see what has changed here, is basically you could so basically there is a boolean which says whether this is consumed or not. So that's what we are basically using to update. We were in apply letter of credit. So whenever you create your letter of credit, we say that it is consumed. So consumable false means basically you can't consume it anymore. So basically that means that your purchase order has already been consumed. So that's what we are doing, and we are using it as an output, right? And then the command is your purchase order command, which is basically, you can see here, is your log purchase order command. Right, and obviously once we have this transaction built, what we are going is to do is pretty similar steps that we did earlier. We'll verify this and sign the transaction, finally finalize the transaction, right? So that's what will happen. So basically in most of the cases, what will happen is we'll pull out something from your ledger, and then we'll update our states, and finally create a transaction, verify it, and send it over to your counterparties. So pretty simple if you think of it in that way. But yeah, there are a few cases you have to identify who your parties are and what are the updates that you do. That's something which you have to identify and write it on your own. All right, so I guess we have some questions. All right, so if there is any question, I think someone raised their hand. So if there is any question, please put it on the chat, and then I think we'll be able to answer that. I believe that's pretty much from what we had today. So I just look over the chat for a second and see if there are any questions. All right, I don't see any. So if someone raised a hand, there has to be some question. Okay, there is something on the Q&A. Is there a view of the ledger in the code? Yeah, so to view the ledger, I think what you have to do is, hold on, let me share. Okay. So in order to view your ledger, either you can directly view that using your client. So in the client, you can query the ledger to get your output states and put that on the UI. Or if you want to have like complex kind of things where you're just querying the ledger is not enough, probably you have to build a flow to do that. So to query your ledger, it's pretty simple, just like you see here. So what we are doing is we use the vault service to query for the ledger. And what we are doing is you're doing query by your states. And what states do you really want? You are looking for your purchase order states. So what that will do is it will basically pull out all the purchase order states that you have on the ledger. And then you can return this purchase order states to the UI, and then you can visualize them. And then if you want like to filter that down, you could also use something like a criteria, which is not there in this particular example. But in order to filter out on a particular on the basis of a particular field, then you'll have to create criterias, then pass that on to this query by method, which will basically then filter down your results based on your criteria. um, and also say we have a get transaction flow, which is basically used to get a summary of the transactions, which I showed you on on the which I showed you on the screen, right? So for that we use something called validated transactions dot snapshot, which will give you a list of transactions. And out of those transactions, what we are doing is we're going to filter down some of them based on few of the properties, and finally we are creating a transaction summary object and sending it back to our client, which will then send it to the UI. All right, does that answer? Okay. Any more questions? I guess that would be it. All right. Thank you so much for joining, guys. And I hope it was a fruitful session for you. You learned something about letter of credit and how it really works, and how Corda really makes it easy for you guys to actually build an application like this. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining in, and thanks for listening to us. And I hope we will see you again in the next webinar. All right. Goodbye.